Україна не визнає юридично окупацію Криму. Нема про що говорити. Це поза нашою Конституцією. Це наша територія. Територія народу України. Ми не можемо просто, а чому би ні? Чого не буде? Мені здається, що...
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else to talk about, right? I mean, that's Volodymyr Zelensky, I think today, saying that when asked about this claim that whether the United States is willing to wash its hands, which we'll get to in a second of this deal, but in any case, if the deal that we are having on the table is that Crimea will be internationally recognized by the United States as actual Russian territory, and his comment is just like, yeah, that ain't happening, as though it's something in his power to call. And try to make some sense out of stuff that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. We have John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and great friend of this show. Welcome back to the show, first of all.
Glad to be here as always, Danny.
Man, we got a lot of stuff to talk about today, but unfortunately/fortunately, I don't know just how it is. It seems like we have to, first of all, measure sanity and the ability of people to make rational calculations when you're talking about maybe getting to the literal end state and the end game on these negotiations and where they're heading. And then to the entry play for Zelensky on the day that there's supposed to be a meeting in London to give what's apparently an ultimatum by the United States. You have Zelensky saying, yeah, I'm not doing this. What do you think of when you heard Zelensky say that?
I mean, I wasn't surprised at all. I'm surprised the administration thinks that you could possibly get Zelensky to agree to de jure control of Crimea by Russia, and also de facto control of a huge chunk of those 4 oblasts that the Russians now control. He's not going to accept either one of those things. And if he does, others in his country who have a lot of political weight won't. I mean, the fact is that this proposal that the administration is putting forth makes no sense at all, because it's not only Zelensky who's going to reject the territorial deal that's on the table. The Russians are going to reject it as well. And indeed, all the evidence is that the Russians have rejected it. So this is a plan that's going nowhere.
Either it's a plan that's going nowhere, or it's a plan that's going exactly according to plan, because maybe the Americans are intending to say, we're putting these conditions on, we know that no one's going to accept, and then we are going to walk away. Here's just hours ago, the Vice President of the United States directly talking about what we will and won't do.
We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process. We've engaged in an extraordinary amount of diplomacy, of on-the-ground work. We've really tried to understand things from the perspective of both the Ukrainians and the Russians. What do Ukrainians care the most about? What do the Russians care the most about? And I think that we've put together a very fair proposal. We're going to see if the Europeans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians are ultimately able to get this thing over the finish line. Again, I feel pretty optimistic about it. I think everybody has been negotiating in good faith, but it's now time, I think, to take, if not the final step, one of the final steps, which is at a broad level, the parties saying, we're going to stop the killing, we're going to freeze the territorial lines at some level close to where they are today.
I want to look at a couple of things that he said in there. The first one I want to go back into, especially as an international relations theorist and as a historian par excellence, his comment that we have done an extraordinary amount of diplomacy, and they haven't even been in office 100 days yet. And I'm thinking in comparison to the end of term negotiations, end of war negotiations of other conflicts that have happened in the past, doesn't seem like that's really a lot of diplomacy.
There's a limit to what you can do, obviously, in 100 days. I think there's no question that they've done considerable diplomacy, mainly with Steve Witkoff going and talking to Putin. I think it's quite clear that we understand, or at least Witkoff understands, what the Russians want. You and I on the outside fully understand what the Russians want. The problem that the administration faces is twofold. First of all, there's a big division inside the administration on whether or not to concede to Russia's principal demands. I believe that Witkoff and ultimately Trump are willing to do that. But there's huge opposition from others. So it's almost impossible for the administration to get together. And here we're talking about Rubio on one side and Witkoff on the other, and come up with a deal, right, that is coherent, that makes sense, that you can sell to the Russians. Now, what about the Russians and the Ukrainians? That's the second big problem here. You cannot come up with a deal that the Russians and the Ukrainians will both accept. It's just impossible. And if you come up with a deal along the lines I think Witkoff would like to fashion, the Ukrainians will reject it out of hand. And if you do the opposite, you come up with a deal along the lines that Rubio and General Keith Kellogg would like to put forward, the Ukrainians would probably accept it, but the Russians will reject it out of hand. So there's no deal to be had here between the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians on the other. And there's no meaningful deal to be worked out between Rubio on one side and Witkoff on the other side. So this is all a charade.
Well, yeah, that's and this is coming on the day that there was supposed to have been as recently as Sunday. They were talking about that this was going to be a kind of a really important big deal or a negotiation between the Secretary of State Rubio, the Secretary Lamy on the UK side at the foreign ministry level. Ukraine was going to be there, et cetera. They were going to come to the unified position. And then later in the week, Witkoff would take whatever was agreed to there and go to Russia to see if they could have an ultimate deal. But now then, prior to this, and this is where I want to ask him, I don't know if you either know or you can theorize, all of a sudden last night, you had Secretary of State Rubio and Witkoff saying, we're not going to actually go to London. We're just going to send Keith Kellogg. And then at which time then the other foreign ministers also said, yeah, well, we're not going either. So it turned out to just be, who knows what it actually was. We haven't heard any statements, at least as of the time we're broadcasting here, what was said there. But that implies to me that probably, and this is where I want your opinion, probably the European side said, well, there's no point in you coming and giving us an ultimatum because we're not going to agree to any of that anyway. And then Rubio says, yeah, well, then I'm not even coming. What do you make of the fact that Rubio didn't come, first of all?
Well, I think the Ukrainians, and here we're talking mainly about Zelensky, made it clear that they didn't want to talk about this new proposal. What they wanted to talk about was a 30-day ceasefire. I mean, Zelensky doesn't want to touch this deal that's on the table. It's just unacceptable to him. So he wanted to switch the subject and go back to talking about a 30-day ceasefire. At least that's what you read in the press. And Rubio and Witkoff and the Americans more generally understood this was a non-starter. It wasn't going to go anywhere. So they pulled out. And then the Europeans pulled out. The Europeans are not sending their foreign ministers to the meeting either. So it's a low-level meeting that's taking place today in London, in large part because the Ukrainians bailed.
And I wonder how much of a negotiation is even taking place. And I want to ask you something that, from a book that I've recently read, and I wonder if you can explain how it works because of what just happened. So Rubio didn't go. We can theorize it was probably because they're not going to be able to reach a deal or whatever. But you had the spokeswoman, Tammy Bruce, for the State Department, that said, "Oh, don't read anything into that. This is just a scheduling issue. He wasn't able to get." And yet, when I read this book here, I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. He's a guy named John Mearsheimer. Wrote this book of Why Leaders Lie. It's been on my bookshelf for a long time. I just found it the other day. And you explained the truth about lying in international politics. And since that is such a big thing about what's been going on right now, why would we say stuff like that that's self-evidently untrue?
Well, we're just sort of trying to make it clear that this negotiation was supposed to take place today and didn't take place doesn't represent a failure on our part. And it, in effect, is a failure on our part. We had this deal apparently worked out that we wanted to present to the Ukrainians in the presence of the Europeans and get them to decide one way or another whether they would accept it. But we failed to get the Ukrainians on board, and then the Europeans pulled out. So this is, a colossal mess. And we want to cover that fact up. And we're saying it's not because of what the Ukrainians tried to do. It's because of a scheduling conflict. This, of course, is not true. But this kind of deception takes place often in international politics. And in the case of the Ukraine war and in the case of the Gaza war, the amount of deception that takes place on a daily basis is staggering. It's hard to figure out what to believe anymore regarding both of those conflicts because there's so much lying, so much deception in both cases.
Now, you had made the point in that book that there are some situations and circumstances in normal times to where some amount of lying is actually necessary to conduct negotiations in statecraft. But it sounds like that you're now saying that we've taken it to such a level now that it's just off the charts.
Yeah, it's very important to understand, and I make this point clear in the book, that lying is only effective when the other side thinks you're telling the truth. If you lie all the time, lying is not an effective instrument of statecraft because the other side just assumes you lie all the time and they don't believe anything you say.
Even if you're telling the truth sometimes.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's why almost all of us on the outside have a devil of a time figuring out whether the statements that various governments make involving the Ukraine war or the Israelis talking about what they're doing in Gaza, whether they're telling the truth or not, because they both lie so much that lying is no longer an effective tool.
Yeah, that's by itself a really dark spot on our current culture and climate in the politics.
Absolutely.
And to really tag off of that and to show the latest that we don't know for sure what's being meant here. This is being reported by Ukrainian media just a short time ago, like less than an hour ago. I think it popped up on my screen anyway, is that Rubio has given some additional information. He says, what I would say is we're involved in understanding what is the Russian position. We have a better understanding of that now because we've actually spoken to them after 3 years of not speaking to them. What is the Ukrainian position, and figure out if these guys are in the same neighborhood, because if they're in completely different zip codes, then we may have to conclude that they're so far apart that peace is impossible at this time. And then he added one of the important ones: if at some point we determine that we're just too far apart, not enough movement is happening, we may need to move on to other priorities because there are a lot of other important things that are happening in the world. This is not our war. Now, of course, here again, a lot of that is true. But the question is to what extent are we going to do something with that? Because if you're saying, if we reach the conclusion that they're not on the same zip code, and they're clearly not, as you already laid out in this episode here, then it sounds like that the only thing we're waiting on now is just the announcement that the U.S. is going to walk. How do you see it?
Well, you were intimating that what's going on here is that we're putting out this proposal. We understand it's not going to work, and it's going to provide cover for us to walk away. That may be true. I don't know. It's a clever strategy, and I don't want to give this administration, much credit for being clever, because everything they've done up to now indicates they're not very clever. But the end result here, Danny, is that this one is going to be settled on the battlefield, as you and I have said on numerous occasions. There's no diplomatic solution here. The Russians are hard-nosed regarding their three principal demands. They've told Witkoff this. They've made it clear time after time. And there's no way that the Europeans and the Ukrainians, for sure, are going to accept those Russian demands. I think there's some reasonable chance that Trump will accept those demands, right? Or would accept those demands under certain circumstances. He would basically cave to the Russians. But the Ukrainians are not, and the British and their allies in Europe are not. So this war is likely to go on, and I think it'll be settled on the battlefield.
And so let's see how we would get to that point. So let's say that, because Trump said a couple of days ago, or maybe one day ago, that he would reveal the outlines of his plan in 3 days, which he said, which I believe the third day would be tomorrow. after this meeting here, or maybe he'll push it back a little bit until after Witkoff goes to Moscow, which apparently is going to come either Thursday or Friday. But whenever it is, he's going to come out and he's going to say, here's my last offer for peace. And if nobody wants to take it, then we're going to walk. And then nobody takes it, meaning Ukraine and Europe. And he says, okay, that's it. We're out. We're done. We're not going to give any more weapons, anything else. What happens on the next day in the war in Kiev and in Brussels?
Well, I don't think you want to ask what happens the next day. That's too soon. But if the Americans walk, the Americans are eventually going to let the flow of arms to Ukraine end. They may let what's in the Biden pipeline continue to go to Ukraine, but after that, it's over. And we will surely diminish our providing intelligence to the Ukrainians as well. Now, as you and I both know, the Russians are winning on the battlefield, even with the flow of American weapons and the provision of American intelligence to the Ukrainians. So once the flow of American weaponry begins to dry up in a serious way, the Ukrainians will be in more trouble than ever. And the Russians, who are building up their forces and training up their forces and have their forces armed to the teeth, will do much better on the battlefield as the balance of power shifts against the Ukrainians. The Russians will end up taking more territory. And at some point, the Ukrainian military will collapse and they'll come to us and they'll ask us to help to negotiate a settlement because they're going to lose on the battlefield. The Russians are ultimately going to win. So I think that is how this one is going to play itself out. I think at this point in time, it's impossible to see how you get or even come close to getting a negotiated settlement.
Well, and I think that Vladimir Putin has given justification to nearly every point you just made there today. He actually had a meeting with, I guess, some of his defense industrial base leaders in his country, and he addressed two separate issues that I want to take in sequence because they both scream, we don't have any expectation at all that this is going to be solved by diplomacy, and we are doing everything in the world to prepare for further combat. First of all, here he is talking about the specific war-making capacity.
This year, the tasks are even more extensive, including the implementation of the program to expand and modernize the defense industrial complex's production capacities, which involves over 400 enterprises. I emphasize today our experience in conducting the special military operation, both in terms of tactics and the technical development of weaponry, is being studied, without any exaggeration, by all the world's armies, leaders of the global arms industry, and high-tech companies. And we must stay one step ahead, as we have repeatedly managed to do recently, and I am confident will continue to do in the future.
Absolutely nothing implying there that he thinks that the war is on the verge of maybe coming to a diplomatic end. He is full steam ahead going that we're going to expand our defense industrial capacity. And because we know people around the world are watching us, and certainly they are, then we have to continue to evolve our war making capacity. Do you read that any differently than what I interpreted?
No, but you want to remember, Danny, the Europeans and the Ukrainians basically are thinking like Putin. They want the war to continue. The only one who wants to end the war is President Trump and Steve Witkoff. Just important to understand it. I think Rubio, Keith Kellogg, and most people in the American national security establishment want to see this war continue because they think that the Ukrainians can turn the tide on the battlefield. Trump is the anomaly here, Trump and a few of his lieutenants. But otherwise, everybody wants this war to continue. And you have to ask yourself then, how is this going to play out? And there are a lot of people in the West who believe the Ukrainians can ultimately prevail. And I don't think that's true. And I know you don't think that's true. And we're going to see what happens. And I think the Ukrainians are going to end up much worse off tomorrow than they are today on the battlefield. But convincing most people in the West and in Ukraine of that is well nigh impossible.
Now, if I think the main recipient of that message that Putin gave there about the defense industrial base was for Ukraine, I wonder if his next comment that I'm going to put here might not be for Europe or NATO, because when he's talking about here is going to be the expansion and the increasing capacity of his war-making capacity on his armed forces as well. Watch this.
As I have already said, we must continue, without bureaucratic delays, to efficiently adapt weapons and equipment to new, rapidly evolving forms and methods of warfare. We have all the necessary capabilities for this. Taking into account combat experience, we must update training programs in military schools and academies, as well as in junior officer and sergeant schools. At the same time, we must thoroughly and rigorously revise the combat manuals of the ground forces, from the level of squads and companies up to corps and combined arms armies. Let me reiterate, these processes must proceed simultaneously and in close interconnection with one another. And of course, we must take into account global trends in military technology development to the fullest extent. That is, forecast and understand what potential armed conflicts of the future may look like, because the future is rapidly approaching.
So if you're a NATO member and you hear that, that sounds to me like we're looking to see what you guys are doing, and we're going to take where we are and expand it to also stay one step ahead on that time.
Yeah, I mean, Putin is making it clear that Russia is fully mobilized for war, and it plans to stay fully mobilized for war, and it's going to do everything it can to maintain its present advantage over the Ukrainians on the battlefield. This is hardly surprising. And he appears to be quite confident about where Russia is headed in this regard.
Now, as a military vet yourself, how would you characterize the condition of the Russian armed forces as it exists right now and the direction where its head wants to take it, as compared to where the current capacity on the NATO side is and where their various heads seem to want to take them?
Well, if you start with the NATO side, it's not clear who the head is anymore. Before Donald Trump came to office, it was clear that we were the head. And to the extent that we had somebody in the cockpit next to us, it was the British. And as you know, there was this big article in the New York Times talking about the extent to which the American military was involved in planning and executing the war in Ukraine. And then a subsequent piece appeared in the Times of London, which made it clear that the British military was equally involved. So it was the British and the Americans who were deeply involved. We were the head. But with Trump, he's interested in turning over responsibility for the war in Ukraine to the Europeans. And who ultimately becomes the head there is a really tricky issue. Will it be the Germans? Will it be the British? Will it be the French? They're going to be serious collective action problems. So I would argue that with the passage of time, if Trump continues to withdraw from Europe, the Europeans are going to have trouble getting their act together to deal with Russia. With regard to Russia, it's a pretty straightforward case. Their military capabilities have increased greatly since the first year of the war. General Cavoli, who is the commander-in-chief or Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has made this clear in his congressional testimony. The Russian army is much larger now than it was in 2022. It is much better trained. It has a lot of combat experience. It's certainly not hurting for weaponry, and its weaponry is quite sophisticated. So the Russians are in really good shape. And I think the big question at this point in time, certainly for people like us, Danny, is what the Russian offensive is going to look like this spring and this summer. How big is it going to be? Where is it going to be where are the central points of attack going to be located, and what will be the consequences? But it's the Russians who we expect to be on the offensive in a serious way, not the Ukrainians. And with regard to the Ukrainians, the only interesting question is whether they can hold out until the end of the year, especially if American military supplies and American intelligence assistance dries up.
Yeah, I think that there's virtually no chance of them lasting that long. Before I shift gears a little bit here, I want to stick with this theme here because you talk about the second ago that the head used to be the United States of NATO, but now then when you see the Russians very clearly focused from the commander in chief all the way down to their senior generals on recognizing the reality. They seem to be absolutely focused on these things were good, these things were bad. We're going to improve here, we're going to improve there. And they have accurately, in my view, assessed the right places where they have to make improvements and are moving in that direction. On the other side, we just seem to have nothing but complete chaos on the United States Department of Defense. We can probably do a whole show on that right there, but that does not lead a lot of optimism that the current Secretary of Defense is going to be able to lead us in a same kind of coherent, analytical-based, fact-based move into the future to improve our combat capability to try and stay at pace with what's going on here. And you could say the same thing of the British, quite frankly, or the French. I mean, they don't seem to be focused on reality other than lots of phrases and bumper stickers, but I don't see a lot of that. So it seems to me that the gap is going to increase over time.
Well, I don't want to defend Pete Hegseth, but Pete Hegseth is not the only problem that we face here. If you look at the performance of the American military since the first Gulf War, and you look at, and of course, the first Gulf War was in 1991. And if you look at the performance of the American national security elite since 1991, it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah,
we have not
totally agree with that.
And I would note to you, if you look at the commentary of the American generals and admirals who consistently appear in the mainstream media and opine on the Ukraine war, the Iran situation, the Gaza war, I would argue their analysis is anything but impressive. So I think the point here, Danny, is Pete Hegseth aside, there's a really deep-seated problem in the American national security community, which includes not just the civilians, but the military as well. We're in trouble. There's really something wrong here.
I couldn't agree with you more. We actually did a bit of a show not long ago, a week or so ago, on the generalship, and we started with Westmoreland, then we went to Petraeus and before the Afghan disaster, whatever, and some of the things Cavoli says about how great things seem to be going and how Russia's diminishing and getting weaker, oddly enough, while he's also saying some of the other things you cited there about how Russia's improving and increasing. Not sure how he comes to those conclusions, but it does show that there are some real problems with American generalship on top of civilian issues there as well. By the way, Gary just found something while we've been on the air here. Gary, if you can pop that up. Apparently Trump himself has said something about this situation. Let's see what it say. The situation for Ukraine is dire. He can have a peace or he can fight for another 3 years before losing the whole country. I have nothing to do with Russia, but have much to do with wanting to save on average 5,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers a week who are dying for no reason whatsoever. The statement made by Zelensky today will do nothing but prolong the killing field, and nobody wants that. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play should now finally get it done. So kind of sounds like that he is genuinely ready to walk from this, by the way.
I mean, I think Trump fully understands the situation, whether he can, come up with a coherent plan and a coherent way of dealing with the Ukraine war is another matter. But Witkoff is his right-hand man. He's his alter ego. Witkoff has had lengthy conversations with Putin. I'm sure that Witkoff, who's a very smart man, he might not have much experience as a diplomat, but he's no fool. Witkoff understands what's necessary to get the Russians on board. And I'm sure Witkoff, like Trump, understands that the Ukrainians are in desperate straits. Their situation is not going to improve. Excuse me. And now is the time to settle, not later. But whether or not, again, Trump can fashion a deal is an open question.
Well, we're certainly going to find out, and we could literally be finding out within days, or maybe even hours if more true social posts like that one come out. That might answer the question here. In the remaining time we have, I want to shift gears a little bit here to the other area that the Trump administration and the Department of Defense is trying to figure out, and that is what is going to happen with Iran in the Middle East. Now, we are on a pace, and Trump has been saying since he came into office that he wants to negotiate a new deal with Iran, that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons, he declaratively stated, and we're trying to use diplomacy. Now, Trump himself has seemed to shift quite a bit in the last, say, month and a half. On the 7th of March in the Oval Office, he made it sound like the war was basically already determined and that we were in the last days before something was going to happen. He said, we're running out of time, folks. We're just about there. They can't have a nuclear weapon, and we can either do it with negotiations, or, as he said in a different one, that bombs will fall if they don't get a negotiated settlement. And then all of a sudden he kind of shifted gears a little bit and said, well, but maybe we can work something out. And then we had on 2 Saturdays in a row, we had some diplomacy, et cetera, where we sent some people to talk, and he says, yeah, maybe that's good. But even then, talking about Witkoff, he went on one time and said, yeah, we might can work something out, 3.67% reprocessing they can keep. And then the next day he seemed to kind of walk it back and say, well, actually, they don't have any reprocessing. Meanwhile, while all that's going on, and you've kind of alluded to this a little bit in the almost a Jekyll Hyde kind of situation in the United States about our foreign policy focus, you had the Dr. Jekyll, I think, side saying, you know what, we don't need to have any kind of diplomacy with Iran. We just need to kill them all. Here is Senator Cotton kind of giving that view.
I think it's important to remember how we got to this point as well. We got here because of the terrible Obama deal with Iran that allowed them to enrich uranium, that allowed them to keep all their centrifuges, that allowed them to continue research into ballistic missiles. President Trump has been clear that Iran has no reason to enrich uranium. They therefore have no reason to keep their centrifuges, and they certainly have no reason to be developing intercontinental missiles that could hit the United States. If Iran is willing to make a deal on those terms, and as President Trump said last week, we can have peace and they can live happily without death. But if they insist on keeping all that enriched uranium and all those centrifuges and their missile program, as he has said, we're going to have to take a different path.
Yeah, we're going to have to, but Professor, how is any country on the earth going to say, sure, we'll just hand over all of our missiles, all of our weapons program, or even just a nuclear pre-processing facility, et cetera, and we'll just trust you that nothing bad will happen to us in the future? Where do you see this going?
Well, the key issue here is enrichment of uranium. Actually, there are 2 related programs here. One is reprocessing plutonium and enriching uranium. This is how you produce the fissile material to make a bomb. And what the Israelis and the right in the United States hated about the JCPOA, the 2015 agreement with Iran, was the fact, as Senator Cotton said, that Iran was allowed to keep its enrichment capability. And when Trump pulled out in 2018, he said that that was one of the main problems. Now, the question on the table today is whether or not we are going to allow allow Iran to keep its enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. That's the question. They insist that they will keep that capability. Will we swallow that? If we don't swallow it, then I would assume Trump is going to go to war. If we do swallow it, if we do accept the fact that they're going to keep their enrichment and reprocessing capabilities, then we're basically back to hopefully a better version of the JCPOA, maybe one that doesn't have any sunset clauses. But if Trump goes down that road, which I certainly hope he does, and accepts the fact that they will keep a limited enrichment capability, the Israel lobby, Israel itself, and all of these super hawks like Tom Cotton will go after President Trump big time for caving in to the Iranians. So Trump is between a rock and a hard place here. But I think in the final analysis, he doesn't have much choice but to accept a new version of the JCPOA where the Iranians get to keep their enrichment capability, because the alternative, as he describes it, is war. And war, in my opinion, would be sheer lunacy at this point in time from President Trump's point of view, not to mention our country's point of view.
Yeah, well, I've seen in recent days Rebecca Heinrichs, who's a definite war hawker, who's saying, no, there can't be 3.67%. There can't be any percent. So there's absolutely no way we're going to have that. We've shown in recent days here, General Jack Keane from last weekend, where he just like almost seems beside himself with, no, we need to go with the military option here. We need to give an ultimatum or has already given, he claimed, an ultimatum, and it literally just completely demilitarizes Iran willingly, or we can go in and do it another way, etc. But then on the Iranian side, they don't seem to be ready to just back down and just surrender and roll over. As a matter of fact, this Iranian advisor to their nuclear program had this to say.
Iran, with regards to defense capabilities, it is prepared for war. It would fight its own wars. Doesn't need like the Russian soldiers or Chinese soldiers or anyone's soldiers. And Iran's allies across the region, especially in Iraq, and in Yemen, as we're seeing, they will have an enormous role to play if there is war. And they would change the map very swiftly. Iran itself, therefore, would be more than capable of firing off missiles, bringing down jets, firing hundreds of thousands of drones. That is a fact. But Iran's relationships with powers like Russia and China are very important. Russia, China today are much closer to Iran than they've ever been before, thanks to the United States. Many thanks to the United States. The war in Ukraine has evolved the relationship.
I'm going to get to that Russia-China component here in just a second. But first of all, I want to stick with the military aspect of this from the Iranian side. Now, they have claimed, and he did here, that they have pretty robust air defenses. They can shoot down planes. They can launch their own missiles, et cetera, and that they're ready for war, et cetera. But then there's others who say that's just a bunch of bluster. They have shown in the two rounds of clashes with Israel last year that Israel went in, especially on the second one, took out what's claimed anyway to be most of the air defense capability for the Iranian side, et cetera. Do you think that Iran actually would pose a legitimate and difficult military task, or do you think that they're a paper tiger?
Well, a couple points. First of all, the Israelis greatly exaggerate how much damage they did last October when they went and attacked Iran. Iran still has substantial air defense capabilities. Second point I'd make is that when you launch an air offensive against a country like Iran, it's not like you send a handful of aircraft and a handful of missiles in there and you do pinpoint strikes. If you go into a country like Iran with the thought in mind that you're going to tear apart their nuclear infrastructure, you're talking about going after a huge target set, because not only do you have to go after the nuclear infrastructure, and that involves lots of different targets, you also have to go after the air defenses. You have to clean out all the air defenses. You have to create a situation where you can fly over all the targets basically unmolested. And you have to be able to stay on top of those targets for a long period of time, because you're not going to just take them out in one fell swoop. So this is going to be a major operation, right? You're going to war against Iran. Now, the third point is, it is not clear to me that the United States can take out the key nuclear targets, the places where the centrifuges are, where the fissile material is likely to be produced. And in fact, I don't think we can take out the site at Fordo. I think even if we use our 30,000 pound massive ordnance bomb, which the B-2 bomber carries, I don't think it can get down far enough into the mountain where the centrifuges are to finish it off. But even if we do that, it's widely agreed that it'll buy us maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe 1 year of time before they reconstitute the program. So you want to understand that if everything works out swimmingly here, we're not going to decisively defeat the Ukrainians in the sense that we're going to eliminate their nuclear capabilities forever. No. And in fact, they have said on a number of occasions that if you attack us, we will then go out and develop nuclear weapons. And of course, that would be the commonsensical thing to do. So that's one half of the story. The other half of the story is the Iranians have a retaliatory capability. And what they can do is they can strike Israel. They have lots of ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles included. They can attack American military bases around the region and kill Americans. And very importantly, they can strike against oil installations all over the Middle East, shut down the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, and create catastrophic effects on the international economy, which is already in trouble. And the last thing we need is a major oil crisis. So they have real cards to play here. This is not a paper tiger. Again, even if you go in and let's assume that it all works and you take out the nuclear capability at Natanz and at Fordow, those are the two key sites where they enrich the uranium. Let's assume it works swimmingly. You're still in deep kimchi. This is bad news, right? There's no simple solution here. And Trump and his lieutenants understand this. And this is why they're basically headed back towards the JCPOA, although they think they can get a better deal than Obama got the last time, and hopefully they can. But the fact is, the Iranians are not going to give up their centrifuges. They're not going to give up their enrichment capability. So that's where we are.
And what would you expect to happen militarily if for whatever reason Trump and Israel decided, yes, we're going to take that deal, we're going to do the swimmingly version, as you say, and it actually does set them back for a year? So what will Iran do in response to this? Meaning, will this just be an operation, a week-long massive bombing campaign, and then, okay, cool, that's it, we're done now for a year? Or do you think that Iran would just say, no, you went to war with us, and so now here we go, here's our response, and it's not going to stop, and then we could get into a bigger war? What, in fact, even a better question than that, what would happen if they did what you suggested was possible, and in retaliation, they killed a bunch of Americans in some in Iraq, some in Syria, where we're still at or so, and now then we have a bunch of body bags coming home at Dover Air Force Base?
It's a terrific question, because what you're introducing into the discussion, which I didn't talk about, is the potential for escalation over time. I was talking more about horizontal escalation in the region, but the fact is, as you go up the escalation ladder, what does it look like? I would make 2 points here. The first point is, if you look at the international relations literature, one of the subjects that we do not understand very well is escalation dynamics. Very hard to predict how these things play out over time. Second point I would make to you is, nevertheless, there's no question, and you were hinting at this, that there will be incentives on both sides to escalate. In other words, if we whack Iran and then Iran whacks Israel, the incentives for Israel to go back and hit Iran, and then for Iran to go back and hit Israel, and so forth and so on, is very great. And if the Iranians were to kill Americans, the incentives for the Americans to retaliate against the Iranians would be very great. And where this all ends, it's difficult to say. It would end, but how far it would go, who knows? You also want to remember that we'll go in there in this scenario. We'll do a great deal of destruction, but there will be some targets that once we do the battle damage assessment, we'll see that they're still standing, and there will be powerful incentives to go back in and get them. And then the question is, what will the Iranians do then? And then we haven't even talked about this. What will the Russians and the Chinese do?
Well, yeah,
So-
and in fact, I wanted to go down that path there because earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday, Sergei Lavrov gave a speech where he was talking about Russian relations and how they're eager to expand them in the Middle East.
We are united in our understanding that no society should tolerate the imposition of foreign values from outside, which undermine its historical roots, spiritual and moral foundations, and internal unity. We reject the pernicious practice of using unilateral restrictive measures, sanctions, against those countries that pursue independent foreign and domestic policies based on national interests and traditions.
And of course, front and center in that is going to be Iran, which is a member of BRICS, which is also has a military deal of some sort with Russia to make Shahed drones and some other kinds of military issues, neither of which is Russia would be keen to see destroyed. So the question is, what would Russia do? We'll take them in turn. What would Russia do? And then what would China do if we started moving down a path to where maybe Iran got destroyed?
Well, a couple points, Danny. First of all, China, Russia, and Iran all understand individually that you have to stand up to the United States. You have to play hardball with the United States. You cannot give an inch because if you do, they'll take advantage of you, whether it's Joe Biden in the cockpit or Donald Trump. You got to play hardball with the United States. Second point that they all understand is that they have to hang together. You're dealing with a very powerful state when you go up against the United States. And the Russians have benefited greatly, as we know, in the Ukraine war from assistance from Iran and assistance from China. That means if Iran's in trouble, the Russians and the Chinese have a deep-seated interest in helping them. Now, how would they help them in this scenario? I don't think that the Russians or the Chinese would get involved militarily or let me put it differently, I don't think they'd get directly involved in the fighting. But I think that once the smoke cleared, the Russians and the Chinese, but especially the Russians, would go to great lengths to provide the Ukrainians with military assistance. Furthermore, I think they would side with them economically, and I think they'd side with them diplomatically. And what should be most worrisome to the United States is the possibility that the Russians and the Chinese, who have not wanted to see who have not wanted to see Iran go nuclear, may now loosen up their opposition and basically stand back while Iran acquires nuclear weapons, which would be disastrous for the United States and also disastrous for Israel. So you do not want to underestimate the amount of trouble that an attack is going to cause us with regard to both Russia and China coming to the assistance of Iran.
And final question here. What do you say to those advocates? And I'm just mentioned a couple there, Jack Keane, John Bolton, of course, a big one, Mike Pompeo, who also wrote something recently basically saying, yeah, just don't worry about all these threats and claims of this stuff. You're a weak stick if you don't go in and take them out here, and we better go in and do it. What do you say to those people?
I say that you folks have basically been in charge of American foreign policy since the Cold War ended. Your view has prevailed at almost every turn. And the end result is failure after failure. And if you look at where the United States is today, we're in deep trouble. And that is in large part due to you. And the reason that Donald Trump got elected was because he ran against you. And many Americans, most Americans, in fact, are tired of your policies because they don't work and they just get us in trouble. So I think it's time for you to basically keep your mouths closed and reflect on the fact that you have been wrong so many times in the past.
No, that's a good word there, and we'll end it right there on finally a positive note. I think as much as you can get positive in something that hasn't happened yet, but we certainly hope that does predominate. We hope that Trump's instincts predominate in both of these situations here. That we get war off the table, that we get one war ended, and prevent one from starting. And then we have all kinds of possibilities for other good things to happen. So let's hope that it works out that way. That's the best we can do today, though.
I'm sad to say you're correct. Hope is all we have at this point.
Yeah, I'd like some better methods, but until we can get some new people back in at some of these higher levels, and well, that's just we'll leave that there for another day. But we have what we have, and we're going to do the best we can to say here is a good path. Go down this one, and we have a better chance of success. And so, in that regard, I'm really grateful for what you do to come on to show how clearly there are some good things to go and pursue. Even now, in these 11th hours, in both cases, we can still avoid some of the worst outcomes, and we appreciate that.
My pleasure, Danny.
And we appreciate you guys too. Always be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't done it before you head out there. And also let you know that we are on podcast. I know a lot of people actually prefer to get their information on podcasts. You get time to watch videos. Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you see, you get your podcast, type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you'll find us there eagerly waiting for you. Thank you very much, and we'll see you this afternoon. We have a triple header today. We have Larry Johnson back on, and Gary Villapiano is going to be in front of the camera this time, and just kind of talking about what in the heck is going on with a lot of chaos that seems to be floating around inside the United States right now, even aside from some of these external things. And you're not going to want to miss that dynamic. Always a good discussion that the three of us have, and we'll do that at 3:00 this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.